more, sissy. Fly. Freedom.
The Relational Power Framework. Our understanding boldness, connection, and the imposter syndrome will reverse the phenomenon of men falling behind. Introduction. Origins of the Relational Power Framework. The Relational Power Framework emerged from a long personal struggle to understand why I often felt a disconnect between my internal capabilities and the presence I projected to the world. For years, I sensed the gap between the confidence I knew I possessed privately and the way I showed up publicly. I felt potential inside me, intellectual strength, insight, ambition, but I could not translate it reliably into action, authority, or sustained confidence. This gap became most visible in my early adult years when I tried to build competence in direction through books, self-development, and endless searching. I looked for ways to feel like myself in the world, ways to bring the internal version of me forward with strength, steadiness, and clarity. Despite all of my efforts, I could not quite bridge the distance. My wife, then girlfriend, was alongside me through this process, watching me wrestle with the confidence in my work, identity, and future. The turning point came during a period of real relational strain, and she began imagining life without me. As she considered a future on her own, she confronted her own fears and responded by taking action, planning, pushing herself toward growth. Observing her in that moment, seeing her fear activate motion instead of paralysis, it revealed a profound truth. I was afraid too, not of physical danger, but of judgment, exposure, failure, or looking lost. Yet the language of fear had never been available to me. As a person who saw myself as a brave man, the environment in which I grew up taught me that fear was about physical danger, and more acutely, physical danger coming from another person. This was a different fear, a fear of exposure, of failure, and of being judged negatively. Seeing her confront her fears was eye-opening. Once I recognized the problem for what it was, it set me on my journey to figuring out for myself, my children, and then for others, how to recognize and conquer this fear. This insight gave me the realization that the men in our society were blind to this debilitating truth. Fear of judgment from others was, to me, one of the two major factors that kept people in general, and men in particular, from reaching their potential. Along the journey, I began pushing myself into uncomfortable spaces as a form of self-intervention. One of these was joining the board of a nonprofit, an environment where I was surrounded by highly skilled, deeply competent people with clear mastery in their fields. Rather than feeling like a fellow expert, I felt like what I later learned was a term called the lovable fool. I was warm, likable, and valued socially, but not competent in the ways that mattered to me. I felt outclassed, overshadowed, and exposed. This experience became a critical case study when later I encountered research on the imposter syndrome or imposterism, especially the work of Amy Cuddy. Cuddy's writing helped me to see something that had always been present but unnamed. I had imposter feelings. Unlike many people who feel imposter syndrome and continue anyway, mine led me to withdraw. I eventually left the organization, not because I lacked intelligence or potential, but because I could not tolerate being in a space where I felt like a lovable, inadequate presence rather than a competent contributor. This raised a key question. Why do some people keep going despite imposter feelings, while others, especially men, drop out? Cuddy's research discussed how when we meet people, we tend to perceive them as either predominantly warm or predominantly competent. Most people want to be seen as competent, but they want others to be warm, because warmth signals safety. What I concluded, and will elaborate on later in this video, is that while women can feel a lack of competence yet still rely on their warmth as a socially valued strength, men are rarely taught to value warmth at all. As a result, men who feel incompetent are far more likely to withdraw because they have no fallback identity that still feels valid or respected. That realization became one of the stones in the foundation of this framework. From there, I began connecting fear, competence, imposterism, male identity structure, risk-taking, and the true nature of power. Together, those threads form the beginnings of what would become the Relational Power Framework. Power versus domination. One of the deepest misunderstandings that boys carry into adulthood is the idea that power and domination are the same thing. They aren't. But the reason boys confuse them makes perfect sense once you look closely at how it develops. Everyone, men and women, want to feel worthy. Worthiness is the fuel behind nearly every human action. Because boys grow up in an environment where strength is visible and rough play is normal, they learn early that a person who can impose his will is the one who wins. Dominance becomes one of the most obvious, tangible signals of worthiness. If you can push harder, jump higher, hit faster, or pin someone to the ground, the world seems to tell you that you matter more. Boys don't consciously decide that domination equals value. It simply becomes an easy to identify and enduring proof of it that they experience. Girls, who cannot rely on physical force to the same degree, don't grow up with domination as their currency. Their power takes shape through negotiation, persuasion, coalition building, and emotional intelligence. Their worthiness is tied to their ability to influence outcomes through people, not through force. As a result, women develop the muscle of relational power far earlier and far more consistently than men do. This difference in development training leads to a cultural illusion that domination is the engine of leadership. It isn't. It never was. The men who actually rise are not the ones who dominate rooms, but the ones who understand rooms. They are the deal makers, the persuaders, the ones who can read an environment, move people, reframe conflict, and orchestrate cooperation. Their power is invisible to boys because it doesn't look like the playground hierarchy they grew up with. It's subtle, strategic, relational, but it is the real thing. Domination, on the other hand, is loud. Power, though, is quiet. Domination forces, power aligns. Domination wins moments, power wins people. The problem is that boys see the loudest expression first and mistake it for the cause. They assume the man at the top is there because he was dominant, rather than because he learned the same relational skills that women were practicing from childhood. This is why so many men spend adulthood trying to perfect the wrong thing. They chase force, volume, and invisible assertion. The men they admire are succeeding through entirely different means. Because their sense of worth is tied to dominance, men develop an almost catastrophic fear of anything that threatens that image, especially failure. Domination cannot coexist with vulnerability. Real power can. But boys were never taught that. And so they carry forward a fragile version of masculinity that cracks anywhere relational skills is required. This is a misunderstanding at the foundation of everything that comes later. Men are overinvested in domination because they were never taught what power actually is. Boldness versus badness. The related confusion happens with boldness. Boys grow up thinking that boldness is the willingness to break rules, defy authority, or show disregard for consequences. The bad boy becomes the prototype of courage. He seems confident, unconcerned with judgment, unpredictable, and immune to fear. But again, people mistake the visible performance for the actual trait. Bad behavior looks like boldness because it appears decisive, dramatic, and unrestrained. It is active. An activity is visible and easy to misinterpret as courage. A boy watching another boy talk back to a teacher, cut class, or provoke confrontation sees fearlessness. What he actually is seeing is disinhibition. They are not the same thing. There can be many factors behind this disinhibition, ranging from a need for attention, the reactivity to hurt and pain, and more often than not, they act from the expectation of the culture of the group of which they are a member. Real boldness is the willingness to move forward despite fear, not in the absence of it. It is directed, not reckless. It requires emotional regulation. internal steadiness, and the ability to tolerate being judged or misunderstood. It is an inner posture, not an outer performance. And many times you will find the same people who exhibit bad behavior are also afraid to act in environments where they don't feel comfortable. Or when they do act, they will do so with carelessness or with abandon precisely to protect themselves from the pain of possible failure and or to regain a sense of control or power from the attention gained from being disruptive. People who are taught to practice real boldness characterized by relational vulnerability, like speaking up, navigating conflict, apologizing, negotiating, asking for help, standing their ground without the shield of physicality. These people learn that boldness is not the abandonment of consequences, but the willingness to face consequence. And since no one starts out competent in the very thing they are trying to learn, failure isn't a detour from success, it's a requirement for it. The reason that fortune favors the bold is because you cannot have reward without risk. Unlike our girls, boys rarely get that relational training formally or informally. They learn that boldness is just a louder form of domination. More force, more certainty, more hesitation. And because they associate hesitation with weakness, they suppress fear not by managing it, but by ignoring it. The result is a counterfeit version of courage that collapses when life requires subtlety, patience, emotional risk, or the ability to endure temporary humiliation. The men who succeed are not the ones who deny fear. They are the ones who relate to it well. They don't act out, they act forward. They don't burn bridges, they build leverage. They don't reject consequences, they evaluate them. But again, boys mislearn the surface instead of the substance. The bad boy looks bold in the same way the dominant boy looks powerful. He is visible, he is dramatic, he draws attention. So boys grow up internalizing a style rather than a skill. Boldness, like power, is relational. It requires engagement with reality, not flight from it. But because boys saw the wrong example first, they grow up chasing a version of boldness that makes them smaller, not larger, louder, but not stronger. Imposter syndrome. Why men drop out. Amy Cuddy's work on presence and imposter feelings began by investigating women. Her early insight, still central here, was that imposterism is not limited to one gender. Women report it, and then researchers found that men do too. But there's a crucial difference in how it plays out socially. Women are more likely to talk about their feelings of imposter syndrome, and are less likely to name it, less likely to ask for help, and less likely to stay in the places that expose those feelings. This is where my personal story becomes the test case. In the nonprofit board I joined as part of pushing myself into uncomfortable spaces, I was not the stereotypical insecure man with no social skills. I was likable, I was warm, people liked me. Yet I felt inadequate. I felt like a lovable fool. So I left. That made me ask, if people who feel like imposters can stay and eventually reap the rewards of persistence, why did I not? And the answer I arrived at is simple and specific. People want to be seen as competent. That is the primary signal we want to give. Competence answers the question, can this person do the job? People also want trustworthiness or warmth, because competence from someone you cannot trust is dangerous. Trustworthiness answers a different question. Can I rely on this person? Both matter, but trustworthiness is the immediate for others, and competence is the immediate signal we want to send to others. Here's a gender twist that matters for men. Men are socially rewarded for competence and taught to prioritize it. From early socialization, rough play, performance, status cues, men learn that values come from doing, winning, and producing. They don't get taught that warmth is an equally legitimate path to being valued. Men are less likely to talk about feelings like imposterism. Because of that socialization, men often hold imposter feelings privately. They judge themselves against a competence standard, and when they come up short, they see no socially acceptable fallback. Some men do have warmth and relational skills, but they often don't value it as a sufficient source of worth. This was my case. I had the warmth, but the warmth didn't feel like enough to justify staying. Warmth didn't buy me the right to be a man in our culture's terms, or I left despite being liked. Women, by contrast, are socialized to value and use warmth. Women can feel like imposters and still stay because the warmth they bring is recognized as valuable. Buys time, trust, social credit, while competence grows. That staying is what lets them accumulate experience, build competence, and eventually be recognized as both warm and competent. In short, imposterism looks similar across genders. The social pathways out of it differs. Women often have relational fallback, i.e. warmth, that lets them remain in a space long enough to become more competent. Men, whose social identity is tied more exclusively to competence, often lack that fallback or don't accept it as a real currency, so they are more likely to withdraw. The observation is not a moral judgment. It is a description of how socialization, identity, and competence/warmth distinction interact to shape who stays and who leaves. It's also the key lever. If men can be taught and come to accept relational practice as a legitimate form of value, they will be better able to remain in spaces where competence is built. True masculinity and the three fallacies. The logical question after examining imposter syndrome is, what happens when an entire generation of men feels this internal collapse of competence and withdraws from the very arenas that would make them more capable? This mass retreat has produced a cultural vacuum, and into that vacuum stepped a series of loud explanations about what masculinity is and what men supposedly need. Some of these explanations come from distressed men trying to reclaim direction. Others come from commentators diagnosing the crisis from the outside. But whether it's the manosphere shouting prescriptions, social critics offering warning, or thought leaders proposing reforms, most of these narratives rest on the fundamental misunderstandings. To understand what real masculine strength requires today, we must expose the three major fallacies shaping the current conversation about men. Fallacies that distort the problem, misdirect the solution, and keep men from developing the relational power that actually changes their lives. If there is one theme tying together the manosphere, the red pill world, and even the more reasonable critics pushing against them, people like Scott Galloway, for example, it is this. Everyone is arguing about masculinity while misunderstanding the very thing that has always made men powerful. The manosphere mistakes dominance for power. Their opponents mistake niceness for emotional maturity. Both sides fail to see what history and lived reality keep showing us. The men who rise are the ones who can manage human beings, not just tasks. In their landmark work, The Lessons of History, historians Will Durant and Ariel Durant argue that real influence does not rest in the ability to control things, but in the ability to lead people. As Will Durant put it, history reports that the men who can manage men manage the men who can manage only things, and the men who can manage money manage all. This insight helps us to understand that even in the context that value physical dominance end up placing relational competence at the summit of leadership. That line matters here because it clarifies the core point. The traits that inspire admiration and attraction have always been relational. The ability to read people, move people, unify people, and give people a sense of belonging. Even in subcultures where physical strength and violence is celebrated, like street gangs, military units, athletic teams, fraternities, even in prison hierarchies, the man at the top is rarely the largest or the strongest. Physical competence may open up the doors, but the relational intelligence determines who stays in the room. Groups do not follow the most intimidating man. They follow the man who can coordinate, regulate, and unify the group. This is why even in environments built on force, leadership often falls to men who are smaller but more emotionally attuned, more persuasive, more strategic, and more consistent in demeanor. They may be capable of physical dominance, but that is not why they are respected. Their influence comes from steadiness, fairness, presence, and the ability to make men feel anchored. In every environment, even the violent ones, power flows toward the man who can create cohesion, not merely the man who can win a fight. Those skills have long been coded as feminine, but this is only because we've conflated masculinity with physical dominance, performance, and winning. The truth is simpler. Real masculine strength has always been the capacity to influence other human beings. Everything else, money, muscles, aggression, are only sometimes tools. They are not the essence. Where the manosphere falls apart. The red pill world believes women are attracted to aggression, detachment, and hardness. They assume that what they call alpha behavior is what creates influence. But if this were true, history would be filled with emotionally flat men rising to the top. The opposite, though, is true. What actually pulls women toward men and pulls men toward certain men is a combination of competence earned through dedication and relational intelligence, not performative toughness, not cruelty, not domination. A man who is competent is something that matters. A man who is competent in something that matters, who understands how to connect with people, is a man who women find compelling, and men naturally follow. This is why the manosphere misses the mark. It obsesses over dominance displays instead of interpersonal capacity that actually generates attraction and authority. Where the critics also miss the mark. On the other side, people like Scott Galloway correctly diagnosed the crisis in young men. The loneliness, the lack of direction, the insecurity, the collapse of purpose. They are right that men are struggling. I agree with Galloway's diagnosis, but the explanation is incomplete. The issue isn't simply economic or educational. It's not about men needing to be nicer or heal. The deeper issue, the one almost no one articulates, is that men have abandoned the very skills that make them powerful. They have embraced the idea that masculinity equals dominance instead of influence. They chase status signals instead of becoming someone others actually want to follow. Why we misread successful men. When you look at the men our culture fixates on, whether you admire them or despise them, the same misunderstanding shows up. Donald Trump, people assume his influence comes from the loudness or belligerence, but his real power is interpersonal. His ability to mirror grievances, signal identification, and create the illusion of personal loyalty is a relational manipulation, a distorted form of real masculine skill. Bill Clinton. People talk about charm as if it were superficial. What Clinton has, what people call the Clinton effect, is attunement. The ability to make individuals feel seen. Again, relational power, not dominance. Elon Musk. People mistake his brashness for the engine of his success. Musk has said repeatedly that people would not want to be inside his mind, that his life is built on obsessive dedication. His competence is not accidental. It is earned through an extreme level of focus. His interpersonal power comes not from swagger, but from the gravitational pull created by competence combined with mission. When people confuse the side effects, eccentricity, narcissism, bravado, for the cause, relational ability, or dedication, they misunderstand what masculinity actually is. The fallacy is not limited to the manosphere. The critics fall for it too. Boys can learn what they were never taught. One of the most persistent myths, and one of the deepest fallacies at play, is that social intelligence is a natural female advantage. Yes, girls often develop certain relational skills earlier, but their early development is not destiny. Relational skills is not biological fate. It is a practice. If boys value relational ability the way they value physical skill or technical competence, they would practice it and acquire it. And when boys do acquire relational intelligence, they become the exact type of men that the rants were describing. The men others willingly follow. What true masculinity actually is. Put plainly, true masculinity is the fusion of two strengths: dedication that produces competence, which creates real-world power, and relational skill, which creates influence over human beings. Men who have competence without relational skills become isolated achievers. Men who have relational skill without competence becomes dependent charmers. Men who combine both become leaders. This is why men who only chase dominance never become powerful. This is why men who reject relational skills never become influential. And this is why young men who are taught only aggression or only niceness end up lost. True masculinity is neither dominance nor gentleness. It is the ability to build something real and move people toward it. And that capacity, combination of competence and relational intelligence, is the very thing that manosphere ignores. Critics underexplain it, and history keeps proving right. Conclusion. The Relational Power Framework began as a personal inquiry, but it reveals a broader truth about masculinity in our time. Men are not collapsing because they lack potential. They are collapsing because they lack a language for their internal experience and a model of power that aligns with human reality. For generations, boys were taught to prize force, certainty, and dominance, the visible currencies of early life. Yet the arenas that shape adult success require a different skill set: emotional regulation, relational intelligence, presence, attunement, and the courage to remain in spaces where competence is still developing. When boys grow into men without these tools, they misinterpret fear as failure, imposterism as identity, and relational difficulty as personal inadequacy. They withdraw from the very environments that would mature them. The culture and narratives surrounding men today, whether hyper-aggressive or hypercritical, fail because they ignore a core truth. Real masculine power has always been relational. It is built not from domination or performance, but from the fusion of competence and connection. The men who rise, the men who are trusted, the men who inspire, are those who can move people, not just outcomes. By reframing masculinity around relational mastery rather than force, we give men a path forward that is both achievable and sustainable. They do not need to choose between toughness and gentleness, confidence and vulnerability, ambition and connection. They need a model that integrates all of these into a coherent identity. The Relational Power Framework offers that integration. It explains why men struggle, why they retreat, and how they can grow. It clarifies skills that matter, fears that derail them, and the fallacies that mislead them. Most importantly, it gives men a new center of gravity, the understanding that influence, presence, and relational intelligence are not threats to masculinity. They are the highest expressions of it.